It was a bitterly cold evening, the kind where the wind cut through even the thickest coats, and the streets were nearly empty. Robert, a self-made millionaire, was driving home from another long day at the office. His mind was preoccupied with business deals and board meetings, but something made him slow down as he passed a dimly lit alley. There, huddled under a tattered blanket, was a woman with two small children clinging to her sides. Robert couldn't explain it, but something about her face stopped him in his tracks. He rolled down his window, the cold air biting at his cheeks, and took a closer look. Her eyes, though weary, held a flicker of something familiar, something that tugged at a memory buried deep within him. His heart began to race as he stepped out of his car, his polished shoes crunching against the frost-covered pavement. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She pulled the blanket tighter around her children, as if trying to shield them from him. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice trembling. Robert's mind raced. It was her. Clara. The girl he had loved decades ago, the one who had vanished without a trace. But how could this be? The Clara he remembered was vibrant and full of life, not this broken woman begging on the streets. "It's me," he said softly, taking a cautious step closer. "Robert." Clara's face paled, and she shook her head, as if trying to deny the reality before her. "No, no, you can't be here. Please, just leave us alone." But Robert couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after all these years. He knelt down, ignoring the cold seeping through his expensive suit, and looked into her eyes. "Clara, I don't know what happened to you, but I'm not leaving you like this. Let me help." The children, sensing their mother's distress, clung to her even tighter. Clara hesitated, her gaze darting between Robert and her children. Finally, she nodded, tears streaming down her face. As Robert helped them into his car, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. How had Clara ended up like this? And why, after all these years, had fate brought them back together? Little did he know, this chance encounter would unravel a story of love, loss, and redemption that would change both of their lives forever. The drive to Robert's home was silent, save for the soft hum of the car's heater and the occasional sniffle from Clara's children. Robert kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the sight of her hollow cheeks and the dark circles under her eyes. She looked so different from the girl he had once known, yet her essence was unmistakable. When they arrived at his sprawling estate, Clara hesitated at the doorstep, her children clutching her hands tightly. "I don't belong here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do," Robert insisted gently. "Please, come inside. You're safe now." Once inside, Robert led them to the living room, where a roaring fire crackled in the fireplace. He handed Clara a warm blanket and brought hot cocoa for the children, who eyed him warily but accepted the drinks with quiet gratitude. Clara sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting to be thrown out at any moment. "Clara," Robert began, sitting across from her, "what happened to you? How did you end up on the streets?" She flinched at the question, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket. "It's a long story," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "I have time," Robert replied, his voice soft but insistent. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. "After I left town, things didn't go as planned. My family lost everything, and I had no one to turn to. I tried to make it on my own, but," her voice broke, and she glanced at her children, who were now curled up beside her, their eyelids heavy with exhaustion. "I couldn't give them the life they deserved." Robert's chest tightened as he listened. He had always wondered what had happened to Clara after she disappeared. He had searched for her, but she had vanished without a trace. Now, seeing her like this, he felt a mix of guilt and sorrow. "Why didn't you reach out to me?" he asked, his voice tinged with regret. Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I couldn't. I was too ashamed. I didn't want you to see me like this. Robert reached out, gently placing a hand on hers. Clara, you have nothing to be ashamed of. I'm just glad I found you. For a moment, Clara's defenses seemed to waver. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to reconcile the man before her with the boy she had once loved. But then she pulled her hand away, her expression hardening. You don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. You have no idea what I've been through. You can't just swoop in and fix everything. Robert leaned back, stung by her words but determined not to give up. I'm not trying to fix everything, he said carefully. I just want to help. You and your children deserve better than living on the streets. Clara's children, sensing the tension, stirred beside her. The younger one, a girl no older than 5, looked up at Robert with wide, innocent eyes. Are you going to hurt us? She asked, her voice small and fearful. Robert's heart shattered at the question. No, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm here to help you and your mom. I promise. Clara's resolve seemed to crumble at her daughter's words. She pulled the child closer, burying her face in the girl's hair as silent sobs shook her shoulders. Robert watched, his own eyes brimming with tears, and made a silent vow to do whatever it took to give Clara and her children a second chance. But as the fire crackled and the children drifted off to sleep, a nagging thought lingered in Robert's mind. What had truly driven Clara to this point? And why did she seem so afraid to let him in? The answers, he knew, would only deepen the emotional storm that was brewing between them. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Robert's home, casting a warm glow over the spacious kitchen. Clara's children sat at the table, their faces bright with smiles as they devoured pancakes drizzled with syrup. It was the first proper meal they'd had in weeks, and their laughter filled the room like music. Clara, however, sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She stared into the steaming liquid, her mind far away. Robert watched her from across the table, his heart heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. Clara, he began gently, I know it's hard, but I need to understand. What happened after you left town? Why didn't you reach out to anyone? Clara sighed, her fingers tightening around the mug. It's not a story I like to tell, she said softly. You don't have to tell me everything, Robert replied. But I want to help, and to do that, I need to know what we're up against. Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering to her children. They were too engrossed in their breakfast to notice the tension in the room. Finally, she nodded. All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it's not easy to hear. She took a deep breath and began. After I left town, my family moved to the city. My father had lost his job, and we were drowning in debt. We thought starting over would give us a fresh chance, but things only got worse. My father fell ill, and without insurance, the medical bills piled up. My mother worked 3 jobs, but it wasn't enough. We lost our home, and I had to drop out of school to help. Robert listened in silence, his heart breaking with every word. I met someone, Clara continued, her voice trembling. He promised to take care of me, to give me the life I'd always dreamed of. I was young and naive, and I believed him. But he wasn't who he said he was. He took everything from me, my savings, my dignity, my hope. When I found out I was pregnant, he left without a word. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she spoke, but she didn't stop. I tried to make it on my own, but it was impossible. I couldn't find work, and I had no one to turn to. Ended up on the streets, just trying to survive. When my daughter was born, I thought things might get better, but they only got harder. And then my son came along, and her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Robert reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on her arm. Clara, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I had no idea. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain and regret. I thought about reaching out to you so many times, she admitted. But I was ashamed. I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want you to know how far I'd fallen. Robert's heart ached for her. You didn't fall, Clara, he said firmly. Life knocked you down, but you're still here. You're still fighting. That's not failure, that's strength. Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand. I've made so many mistakes. I've failed my children in so many ways. You've kept them alive, Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. You've loved them and protected them, even when the world turned its back on you. That's not failure, Clara. That's courage. For a moment, Clara seemed to waver, as if his words were breaking through the walls she had built around herself. But then she looked away, her expression hardening. You don't know the whole story, she said quietly. There's more, things I've done that I'm not proud of. Things I can't take back. Robert frowned, sensing the weight of her words. What do you mean? Clara hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the mug. I did things to survive, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Things I never thought I'd do. I'm not the person you remember, Robert. I'm not that girl anymore. Robert's heart ached at the pain in her voice. Clara, you're still you, he said gently. No matter what you've been through, no matter what you've done, you're still the kind, strong, beautiful person I've always known. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. You don't know that, she whispered. I do, Robert said firmly. And I'm going to prove it to you. As the children finished their breakfast and ran off to explore the house, Robert and Clara sat in silence, the weight of her past hanging heavy in the air. Robert knew there was more to her story, more pain and regret than she had shared. But he also knew that he couldn't give up on her, not now, not ever. The road ahead would be difficult, but Robert was determined to help Clara and her children rebuild their lives. What he didn't know was that the secrets of her past would soon come to light, threatening to unravel everything he thought he knew about the woman he had once loved. Days turned into weeks, and Clara and her children slowly settled into their new life at Robert's home. The children, once timid and wary, began to blossom under the stability and care they had been missing for so long. They laughed more, their eyes brighter, their fears slowly fading. Clara, however, remained guarded, her walls firmly in place despite Robert's persistent kindness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Robert found Clara sitting alone in the garden. She was staring at the flowers, her expression distant and troubled. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. Mind if I join you? He asked gently. Clara glanced up, her eyes shadowed with unspoken thoughts. It's your house, she replied, her tone neutral. Robert sat beside her, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. After a moment, he spoke. Clara, I know this is all overwhelming for you. But I want you to know that you and your children are welcome here for as long as you need. Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Why are you doing this, Robert? She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Why are you being so kind to us? Robert hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because I care about you, he said simply. Because I've never stopped caring about you. Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. You don't owe me anything, Robert. Not after all these years. Not after everything I've done. This isn't about owing anyone, Robert replied firmly. This is about doing what's right. You and your children deserve a chance to start over, and I want to give you that chance. Clara looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and guilt. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your kindness. Robert reached out, gently placing a hand on hers. Clara, you've been through more than anyone should ever have to endure. But that doesn't define you. What defines you is how you keep going, how you fight for your children, how you're still here despite everything. That's what matters. For a moment, Clara seemed to waver, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his words. But then she pulled her hand away, her expression hardening. You don't know the whole story, she said quietly. There's something I haven't told you. Robert frowned, sensing the gravity of her tone. What is it? Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. When I was on the streets, I did things I'm not proud of. Things I can't take back. I stole. I lied. I hurt people. I did whatever I had to do to survive, to keep my children alive. Robert's heart ached at the pain in her voice, but he didn't interrupt. There was one night, Clara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It was winter, and we had nowhere to go. My son was sick, and I couldn't afford medicine. I stole from a store. I got caught, and the owner called the police. I begged him to let me go, to have mercy on me, but he wouldn't listen. I spent the night in jail, and my children were left alone on the streets. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she spoke, her guilt and shame pouring out in waves. I've done terrible things, Robert, she said, her voice breaking. I'm not the person you think I am. I'm not the person you remember. Robert sat in silence for a moment, processing her words. Then he reached out, gently lifting her chin so she would meet his gaze. Clara, he said softly, you're not defined by your mistakes. You're defined by how you rise above them. What you did to survive, to protect your children. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand. I've hurt people. I've broken the law. You've done what you had to do, Robert interrupted gently. And now, you have a chance to start over. To make things right. Let me help you, Clara. Let me give you and your children the life you deserve. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and fear. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this for me? Robert smiled, his eyes soft with compassion. Because I believe in you, he said simply. Because I've always believed in you. For a long moment, Clara sat in silence, her emotions warring within her. Finally, she nodded, her defenses crumbling as tears streamed down her face. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Robert's heart swelled with relief and hope. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to help Clara and her children rebuild their lives. What he didn't know was that the shadows of her past would soon resurface, threatening to undo everything they had worked for. With Clara's tentative agreement to accept Robert's help, a new chapter began for her and her children. Robert wasted no time in ensuring they felt at home. He converted one of the guest rooms into a cozy space for the children, complete with toys, books, and warm blankets. For Clara, he arranged a comfortable room where she could finally rest without fear or worry. The children, Emily and Jack, quickly adapted to their new surroundings. Emily, the older of the two, was a curious and bright 7-year-old who loved to explore the house and ask endless questions. Jack, just 5, was shy but gradually warmed up to Robert, often following him around like a shadow. Their laughter and energy brought a sense of life to the home that Robert hadn't realized he'd been missing. Clara, however, remained reserved. She was grateful for Robert's kindness, but the weight of her past still hung heavily over her. She spent her days helping around the house, cooking meals, and caring for the children, but there was a distance in her eyes that Robert couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as Clara was folding laundry in the living room, Robert approached her with a small smile. I was thinking, he began, maybe it's time to start thinking about the future. For you and the kids. Clara looked up, her hands pausing mid-fold. What do you mean? Well, Robert said, sitting across from her, Emily should be in school, and Jack will be starting soon too. I've already contacted a local school, it's one of the best in the area. They're willing to enroll the kids right away. Clara's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear flickering in them. School, she repeated softly. But I don't have the money for uniforms or supplies or. I'll take care of all that, Robert interrupted gently. You don't have to worry about a thing. Clara looked down at the laundry in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. Robert, I don't know how to thank you. But I can't keep letting you do everything for us. I need to find a way to stand on my own feet. Robert nodded, understanding her need for independence. I get that, he said. And I want to help you get there. I've been thinking, what if we found you a job? Something that lets you use your skills and build a future for yourself and the kids. Clara's eyes filled with uncertainty. I haven't worked in years, she admitted. I don't even know where to start. We'll figure it out together, Robert assured her. You're smart and capable, Clara. You just need a chance to show it. For the first time in weeks, a small smile tugged at Clara's lips. You always did believe in me, she said softly. And I always will, Robert replied. Over the next few days, Robert helped Clara update her resume and apply for jobs. She was nervous at first, doubting her abilities, but Robert's encouragement gave her the confidence to keep going. Meanwhile, Emily and Jack were thrilled about starting school. Robert took them shopping for uniforms and supplies, their excitement infectious as they picked out backpacks and notebooks. But as the days passed, Clara began to notice something that made her uneasy. Robert's kindness, while genuine, felt almost too good to be true. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his actions than he was letting on. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Clara found Robert in his study. He was seated at his desk, poring over documents, but he looked up when she entered. Clara, he said, smiling warmly. Is everything okay? Clara hesitated, her arms crossed over her chest. I need to ask you something, she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. Of course, Robert replied, gesturing for her to sit. Clara remained standing, her eyes fixed on his. Why are you really doing all of this? She asked. Helping me, the kids, it's more than just kindness, isn't it? Robert's smile faltered, and he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What do you mean? I mean, Clara said, her voice rising slightly. That no one does this much for someone without a reason. So, what's yours? What do you want from me? Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. Clara, I'm not doing this because I want something from you. I'm doing it because I care about you. Because I want to see you and the kids happy and safe. Clara shook her head, her eyes narrowing. That's not enough, she said. There's something you're not telling me. I can feel it. Robert hesitated, his gaze dropping to the desk. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension between them palpable. Then he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resolve. You're right, he admitted quietly. There is something I haven't told you. Clara's heart raced as she waited for him to continue. Years ago, Robert began, his voice heavy with regret, my company made some decisions that hurt a lot of people. People like you. I didn't realize it at the time, but I played a part in what happened to your family. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. What are you saying? She whispered. I'm saying, Robert said, his voice trembling, that I owe you more than just kindness. I owe you a chance to rebuild your life, because I helped tear it apart. Clara stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. The man she had trusted, the man she had begun to rely on, was the same man who had indirectly caused her suffering. The room seemed to spin around her as the truth sank in. And in that moment, Clara knew that nothing would ever be the same. The silence in the study was deafening. Clara stood frozen, her mind racing as Robert's words echoed in her ears. The man who had opened his home to her, who had shown her and her children such kindness, was the same man whose actions had contributed to her family's downfall. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless and trembling. "You," Clara's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "You're the reason we lost everything?" Robert's face was pale, his expression filled with guilt and regret. "Clara, I didn't know," he said urgently, rising from his chair. "I swear, I had no idea how deeply my decisions would affect people like you. When I found out, it was too late. I've spent years trying to make amends, but I never knew how to find you." Clara took a step back, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Do you have any idea what we went through?" she demanded, her voice rising with every word. "Do you know what it's like to watch your family fall apart, to have nothing and no one to turn to? To beg on the streets just to feed your children?" Robert flinched, his eyes filled with pain. "I can't imagine," he said quietly. "And I'll never forgive myself for the role I played in your suffering. But Clara, please believe me, I'm trying to make things right. That's why I'm helping you now. Not out of guilt, but because I care about you. Because I want to give you and your children the life you deserve." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to decide that," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't get to swoop in and play the hero after everything you've done." Robert took a step toward her, his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Clara, I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm just trying to help. Please, let me make this right." Clara's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to demand that he leave her alone. But another part of her, the part that had seen the kindness in his actions, the part that had begun to trust him, was torn. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I need to think." Robert nodded, his shoulders slumping with relief. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, no matter what you decide." Clara turned and walked out of the study, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way to the room she shared with her children, her mind racing as she tried to process everything. Emily and Jack were fast asleep, their faces peaceful and innocent. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, watching them, her heart aching with love and fear. How could she trust Robert after what he had told her? How could she let him into their lives, knowing the pain his actions had caused? But at the same time, how could she turn away from the stability and hope he was offering? The next morning, Clara woke early, her mind still heavy with doubt. She found Robert in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the children. He looked up when she entered, his eyes filled with cautious hope. "Good morning," he said softly. Clara nodded, her expression guarded. "We need to talk," she said. Robert set down the spatula he was holding and turned to face her. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you need." Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "But I do know that my children deserve a better life. And if you're serious about helping us, then I'm willing to try." Robert's eyes filled with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "I won't let you down. I promise." Clara nodded, her heart still heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know if she could trust him, but for the sake of her children, she was willing to take the risk. What she didn't know was that the shadows of her past were far from gone. And as she and Robert began to rebuild their lives together, those shadows would soon resurface, threatening to tear everything apart once again. The days that followed were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and navigating the fragile new dynamic between Clara and Robert. Clara remained guarded, her emotions a tangled mix of gratitude and resentment. Robert, for his part, was determined to prove his sincerity, going out of his way to support Clara and her children without overstepping. Emily and Jack, oblivious to the tension between the adults, thrived in their new environment. Emily started school, her natural curiosity and intelligence shining as she made new friends and excelled in her studies. Jack, though still shy, began to open up, his laughter filling the house as he played with the toys Robert had bought for him. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Clara found Robert in the living room, reading a book by the fire. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure of how to start the conversation she knew they needed to have. "Robert," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. He looked up, setting the book aside. "Clara," he replied, his tone warm but cautious. "Is everything okay?" Clara stepped into the room, her arms crossed over her chest. "I've been thinking," she began. "About what you said. About your company and the decisions you made." Robert nodded, his expression serious. "I understand if you're still angry," he said. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight." "I'm not sure I can forgive you at all," Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "But I do want to understand. I want to know why you did what you did." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he said. "When I started my company, I was young and ambitious. I wanted to succeed, to prove myself. But in my drive to grow the business, I made choices that hurt people. I didn't see the bigger picture, how my decisions would ripple out and affect lives like yours. By the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late." Clara listened in silence, her heart aching with the weight of his words. "After that," Robert continued, "I tried to make things right. I changed the way the company operated, focusing on ethical practices and giving back to the community. But it never felt like enough. I couldn't undo the damage I'd caused. And then I found you, and I saw a chance to make a real difference, to help someone I cared about." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and reluctant understanding. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't just erase the past with a few good deeds." "I know," Robert said quietly. "And I'm not trying to. I just want to help you and your children build a better future. That's all." For a long moment, Clara stood in silence, her mind racing as she tried to reconcile her feelings. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. "All right," she said. "I'm willing to try. But I need you to be honest with me from now on. No more secrets, no more half-truths." Robert's eyes filled with relief and gratitude. "I promise," he said. "No more secrets." Over the next few weeks, Clara and Robert worked together to create a stable and nurturing environment for Emily and Jack. Clara enrolled in a local community college, determined to finish her education and build a career. Robert supported her every step of the way, offering encouragement and resources without overstepping. But as Clara began to rebuild her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to resurface. One afternoon, as Clara was studying in the living room, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a man in a suit standing on the doorstep, his expression serious. "Clara Bennett?" he asked. Clara frowned, her heart racing. "Yes? I'm with Child Protective Services," the man said. "We've received a report regarding the welfare of your children. I need to ask you a few questions." Clara's blood ran cold. She glanced over her shoulder, where Emily and Jack were playing quietly, oblivious to the tension in the room. "What kind of report?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man's expression softened slightly. "I'm afraid I can't discuss the details," he said. But I'll need to speak with you and the children. Clara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Who would have reported her? And why? As the man stepped inside, Clara felt a wave of fear and uncertainty wash over her. The life she had worked so hard to rebuild was suddenly hanging in the balance, and she had no idea how to protect it. The visit from Child Protective Services left Clara shaken. The caseworker, a man named Mr. Harris, spent hours asking questions and observing Emily and Jack. He inspected their living conditions, reviewed their school records, and even spoke with Robert, who assured him that Clara was a devoted mother doing her best to provide for her children. When Mr. Harris finally left, Clara felt emotionally drained. She sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she replayed the visit in her mind. Robert sat beside her, his expression filled with concern. "Clara," he said gently, "this doesn't mean anything's wrong. They're just doing their job." Clara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If they take my children away, I don't know what I'll do." Robert reached out, placing a comforting hand on hers. "They're not going to take them," he said firmly. "You're a good mother, Clara. Anyone can see that." Clara looked at him, her heart aching with gratitude and fear. "But what if it's not enough?" she asked. "What if they think I'm not capable of raising them?" "You are," Robert said, his voice steady. "And I'll do everything in my power to make sure they see that." Over the next few days, Clara threw herself into proving her worth as a mother. She attended parenting classes, met with a family counselor, and worked tirelessly to create a stable and nurturing environment for Emily and Jack. Robert supported her every step of the way, using his resources to ensure she had access to the help she needed. But the stress of the situation took its toll. Clara's nights were filled with restless sleep, and her days were consumed by worry. She began to doubt herself, wondering if she was truly capable of giving her children the life they deserved. One evening, as Clara was putting the children to bed, Emily looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy," she said softly, "are we going to be okay?" Clara's heart broke at the question. She knelt beside Emily's bed, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Of course we are, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile. "Why do you ask?" Emily hesitated, her lower lip trembling. "I heard you and Mr. Robert talking," she admitted. "About the people who might take us away." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She pulled Emily into a tight hug, her eyes filling with tears. "No one is going to take you away," she said firmly. "I promise." But even as she spoke the words, Clara couldn't shake the fear that lingered in her heart. The following week, Mr. Harris returned for a follow-up visit. This time, he brought a colleague, a woman named Ms. Carter, who specialized in family reunification. Together, they spent hours observing Clara and her children, asking questions and reviewing documentation. When they finally sat down with Clara to discuss their findings, her heart was pounding in her chest. "Ms. Bennett," Mr. Harris began, his tone professional but kind, "we've completed our evaluation, and I'm pleased to say that we see no reason to remove your children from your care." Clara's breath left her in a rush, her shoulders sagging with relief. "However," Ms. Carter added, "we do have some concerns about your long-term stability. While Mr. Thompson has been a tremendous support, we need to see that you're capable of providing for your children independently." Clara nodded, her mind racing. "I understand," she said. "I'm working on finishing my education and finding a job. I want to give my children the best life possible." Mr. Harris smiled, his expression softening. "That's exactly what we like to hear," he said. "We'll be checking in periodically to monitor your progress, but for now, your children will remain in your care." When the caseworkers left, Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. But it was short-lived. As she sat alone in the living room, the weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her. Robert found her there, her face buried in her hands. He sat beside her, his presence a comforting anchor. "You did it," he said softly. "You proved to them that you're a great mother." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "But what if I can't do this on my own?" she asked. "What if I fail?" Robert shook his head, his expression filled with determination. "You're not alone, Clara," he said. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." For the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself to hope. She leaned into Robert's embrace, her heart aching with gratitude and fear. But as the days passed, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the challenges ahead would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Months passed, and Clara's life began to stabilize. She completed her courses at the community college, earning a certificate in business administration. With Robert's help, she secured a part-time job at a local non-profit organization, where she worked tirelessly to support families in need. Her experiences on the streets gave her a unique perspective, and she quickly became a valued member of the team. Emily and Jack continued to thrive, their laughter and energy filling the house with joy. Emily excelled in school, her natural curiosity and intelligence earning her top marks. Jack, though still shy, began to come out of his shell, his confidence growing with each passing day. But despite the progress, Clara couldn't shake the lingering doubts that haunted her. The fear of failure, of losing everything she had worked so hard to build, was a constant shadow in her mind. One evening, as Clara sat on the porch watching the sunset, Robert joined her. He handed her a cup of tea and sat beside her, his presence a comforting anchor. "You've come so far, Clara," he said softly. "You should be proud of yourself." Clara sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I am," she admitted. "But I still feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like everything could fall apart at any moment." Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand," he said. "But you're stronger than you think. You've faced so much already, and you've come out on top. You don't have to do it alone, you know. I'm here for you, no matter what." Clara looked at him, her heart aching with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "For everything you've done for me and the kids." Robert smiled, his eyes soft with compassion. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Seeing you and the kids happy is all the thanks I need." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing second. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the pain. It was about letting go of the anger and fear that held her back, about embracing the possibility of a brighter future. "Robert," she said softly, "I think I'm ready to forgive you." Robert's eyes filled with tears, his heart swelling with emotion. "Clara," he whispered, "you have no idea how much that means to me." Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "I'm not saying it's easy," she admitted. "But I know now that holding on to the past only hurts me. I want to move forward, for myself and for my children." Robert reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You're an incredible woman, Clara," he said. "And I'm so grateful to have you in my life." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Clara felt a sense of hope and renewal. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she had the strength and support to face whatever challenges came her way. The lesson of forgiveness, she realized, wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about embracing the present and building a future filled with love, hope, and second chances. And as she sat there, hand in hand with Robert, Clara knew that she was ready to take that step forward, for herself, for her children, and for the life they deserved.